Hello, I'm Peter Whittle. Welcome to So What You're Saying Is. Now, a few years ago, the Shadow Chancellor, John MacDonald, famously waved Chairman Mao's Little Red Book in the House of Commons. And more recently, the Shadow Home Secretary, Diana Abbott, said that, on balance, Chairman Mao did more good than harm, quote. Extraordinary, really. It seems that for some people on the left, putting the case for communism has not stopped with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. But quite how communist is Corbyn and the current Labour Party? Now, the writer and author Giles Udy has been looking at this and has written a brilliant article in the current edition of Standpoint, and he's with me now. So, good morning, Giles. Can you tell me, Giles, with this piece that you've just written, you are actually sort of looking at the communist credentials, aren't you, of the people around Corbyn? Because he's sort of portrayed very much, obviously, as a bit of a bogeyman by the right-wing press, but at the same time as, if you like, just a lefty. There's a difference, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, there is a big difference. There are all sorts of variations on the socialist spectrum, from Tony Blair, who many true socialists would believe never was a socialist, right the way through to members of the Communist Party of Britain and various other fringe groups, of which there have been many over the last 100 years, and there are still many kicking around. Most of them are now on board as Corbyn supporters. The thing that attracted me most of all to it in the beginning, or attracted my attention rather, is that I realised there were a lot of individuals that I had known of as extreme left-wingers who were now gathered around the Corbyn circle. And it struck me that nobody who understood what they believed and what they were standing for would actually draw them into an inner circle of advisors and associates unless they really were either neutral or sympathetic with what those particular individuals had been pursuing as a political doctrine for 10, 20, 30, in some cases 40 years.
So the point is, it seems like a very clear thing to us, but I think to most people, you know, this use of the word socialist, the use of the word communist, it all tends to get a bit complicated. You know, do you think that they are actually aiming, as it were, to put in place a hardline socialist or communist state in Britain?
Well, I think it's first of all a good idea that we understand what they would mean by socialism. It was Alexander Solzhenitsyn who actually said that for most people socialism just is something warm and fuzzy. That's right. and good. And I think most people in this country would think of socialism as something warm and fuzzy and good, that's going to look after the poor and is going to make society fairer and perhaps stop some of the excesses of the very wealthy. But as far as the left wing of the Labour Party, as far as the hard left are concerned, all the different phrases you'd call them, socialism means something very, very specific. Socialism it was referred to by Marx and Lenin. We, after all, have the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as one stage towards the utopia of communism, the fully equal society. Socialism is the formation period at which the major parts of the economy are taken over by the state, by the people or by the state. They're nationalised, and it is believed that once that has come into place, then it will naturally morph into communism. So socialism can either mean the process of getting towards communism, but at the same time there were some people, and Marx and Lenin themselves sometimes appear to use Lenin appears to use the phrase interchangeably, whereby the two actually really mean the same thing. And I think to anyone who calls themselves a socialist today, they would understand that this is the takeover of the major parts of production in society, in the banking system and whatever, in order that they can bring communism in. I think there's one big clarification which needs to be made, and that is that democratic socialism, which people like Jeremy Corbyn would say he espouses as his doctrine, is very different from social democracy. We're told that really all they want is a Sweden or a Norway or whatever else. Well, social democracy actually says capitalism is okay, but it needs to be carefully controlled and channeled so that society is fair. Democratic socialism says capitalism is the enemy and must be abolished in every form. The two things are completely incompatible.
So who are these people around Corbyn then that you would particularly, single out as being influential?
Well, I think you do have his long-term colleague from the Stop the War coalition, Andrew Murray. Yeah. Andrew Murray and he have Box and Cox as leaders of the Stop the War coalition. Andrew Murray has been a member of the Communist Party of Britain, which is a very, very small party with only 700 or 800 members. He was a member of the party for 30 or 40 years. He sat on its leadership. He was one of the editorial committee of its theoretical journal, and indeed was actually chosen by the party to give the annual address at Marx's graveside. So a very important and eminent communist figure. And he supposedly left the Communist Party in 2016 and then reappears actually running Jeremy Corbyn's election campaign in 2017. He then went back to Unite, the union of which he's also chief of staff, which is a major funder of the Corbyn programme. And then he has now joined the Labour Party as Jeremy Corbyn's special advisor. So he's one of the key figures. Yeah. And you may have seen in the papers that there's been a little bit of a tussle over whether or not he'd get security clearance, and has he been coming into Parliament without that security clearance and whatever. You look on communist chat rooms where all the old commies get together and swap gossip and stories. And, one of them I read a while back was saying, has he really left the party? He doesn't appear to have changed his views. Yeah. I think there's one very key thing as far as he's concerned, in that if you understand the left today, you'll know that, Monty Python spoofed it, splitters. They're notoriously subdivide and split and turn against each other and whatever else. And if anyone actually betrays one party by leaving it, they're completely cold-shouldered. Well, Andrew Murray has supposedly left the Communist Party of Britain. There have been no condemnations of his departure, whatever, and he is still writing for the Morning Star, which is their newspaper. Jeremy Corbyn was a long-time columnist for the Morning Star, and the Morning Star isn't just a left-wing newspaper. The Morning Star is actually the party newspaper of the Communist Party of Britain, and it has an editorial policy of following the programme of the Communist Party of Britain, which is for the replacement of capitalism by socialism, leading to a communist state. So you would have thought that if he had indeed left the party, he would have been blacklisted, unless he left the party with their blessing in order to be able to join Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, he's Jeremy Corbyn's close colleague, and there are others around there.
Seamus Milne.
Well, yes, plenty of people have mentioned Seamus Milne's role now as Director of Communications for the Labour Party. Seamus Milne has a long history, which the newspapers have raised many times and is easy to find on Google, of a tacit approval of communist regimes in East Germany, and he has regretted the loss of the social benefits that existed under communism. At the same time, those who weren't lucky enough to receive those wonderful benefits were in Stasi prisons or Gulag camps.
I mean, we sort of see this, this kind of apology, this kind of sticking up for these systems all the time. Most recently, of course, now with Venezuela. Yeah. I mean, we have this extraordinary situation in Venezuela, extraordinary crises, and yet there is still this reluctance, isn't there, to condemn the government on the part of Labour. It's extraordinary, don't you think?
It is extraordinary, but at the same time, I think it's actually understandable. Yeah. You need to understand that in the world of British politics, those who are on the right and centre-right don't really have a very well-developed doctrine of what it is they believe in. And many conservatives are conservative simply because they support the status quo. Yeah. And they generally think they have a nice idea of family and whatever. But if you actually just sit them down and say, what precisely do you believe is important about your branch of the political spectrum, they wouldn't really be able to tell you. Talk to a socialist, and they will be able to give you, if they are a true socialist, they'll be able to give you chapter and verse of the political theory. It's virtually another theology, a religious belief. They have their own messiahs, they have their own prophets, they have their own sacred books. Marx's works, now 50 volumes, but we have the Communist Manifesto, and then within the split you've got the various writings of Lenin and Trotsky. Trotskyites don't always get on with other parts of the British left. But overall, they know what they believe. This means, in the case of Venezuela, anybody who, with Chavez and Maduro, have pursued the doctrine of socialism are on our side.
Exactly. Yeah.
And therefore it is very, very hard, having supported them so hard, so publicly, to then ramp back on that. And it's fascinating too that this idea that every failure of socialism is the consequence of a capitalist conspiracy is something that goes on through the history of nation after nation after nation where socialism has got into trouble. Very often socialism's allies abroad will blame those troubles primarily on capitalist powers trying to bring them down.
I mean, this is something obviously you've written about at great length. I've got actually your book here, which is Labour and the Gulag. I can put it up there. It's huge and very disturbing read, which I understand actually, Giles, you sort of almost did by accident, isn't that right? I mean, you started off writing about something else entirely and then came around to the story. But what it does show is that, Labour has got form here, hasn't it? I mean, if you go right back, is it right to say as far as the Bolshevik Revolution? I mean,
well, I think one needs to set as a preamble here that many people who are drawn to socialism are drawn out of a genuine concern for the poor and the needy. They are attracted by something they don't really know, but they believe will help to build a better society. And there have been many people through the history of the Labour Party who have been drawn in for that reason. Yeah. And there are a number of people who've taken we'll discuss the book in a minute, who've taken a very different path. And I would say after the war, Clement Attlee and his Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin were very, very clear and stood a very honourable and good path on this. But I think it is fair too to say that right at the beginning of Labour history, Marx was an attraction. We hear today a lot about the Labour Party is more birthed in Methodism than Marx. And it's something in the book I've looked into in considerable detail. And it's not just my opinion, but the opinion of quite a few Labour historians that actually isn't really the case. For around the turn of the 19th, 20th century, most of the nonconformists in the country were actually liberals rather than Labour supporters. And the Labour Party was drawn really to Marx. They were drawn to the messianic vision, the utopia that he offered in a world which was very different from our own, where inequality was very, very pronounced and social division was very pronounced. And so they were drawn to Marx, and they found in Marx the first vocalization of their heart beliefs, but they found the clear theory set out there. Yeah. And so from the earliest stage, and from the famous Clause 4 in the early Labour Constitution of 1918, I think it was, the goal was the socialisation of society. The instruments of production were to be taken over by the state. The rich were to be expropriated in order that their extreme wealth and their ability to inherit that extreme wealth would be curtailed. So from the very beginning, this is a very, very strong stream. But in the days when the Labour Party was formed in 1906, this was all theoretical. And then suddenly in 1917, we actually see the socialist utopia, the communist future, begin to be realised. And after 10 years of thinking about this, of reading Marx and whatever else, suddenly they see in front of their eyes one country is attempting to become socialist. And there's this immediate emotional response.
So what was
These people must be supported.
At what stage, I mean, we now know, although frankly I'd still say that there's a huge amount of wider ignorance about it, but we now know the extent of, if you like, Stalinist terror in the 1930s, whatever. At what point were people in the Labour Party, if you like, when did they stop, sort of, as it were, covering for it? I mean, when I say covering for it, when did they first know about it? This is the George Orwell said famously that anybody that really, you know, was worth their salt would know in, I think it was 1941, he said, quite what had gone on with the Soviet regime. But weren't there still people around, in the Labour Party indeed, who were actually not quite coming straight about it?
Well, in point of fact, they knew about it with successive bits of information coming to them right from the revolution. They disbelieved the stories of the atrocities. Some may have been exaggerated, but for the most part, they disbelieved the bad stories they heard. They believed they were made up. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the government in Moscow, the Bolsheviks, were pretty cantankerous and belligerent towards foreign socialist or other parties that they thought were a little bit wishy-washy on communism. So the history of the 1920s is one of unity with Russia, and then falling out with Russia, and unity with Russia. But if they fell out, they only fell out with the government. They never fell out with the idea of revolution. And Stalin, after all, didn't start to take power until the late 1920s. Not seriously. And Lenin was establishing death camps right from the days of the revolution. So they were aware of it, but they kept on then returning to this idea that these were our socialist brothers, and turning a blind eye to what was going on, and indeed sometimes even defending it.
Well, I think, is it George Lansbury who said that basically he called communism this great miraculous experiment or something? I don't know at what point he said that, but and basically I think it's all a question, isn't it, of the timing, as you say. In the 1930s, you had this, for example, purge of the clergy in Russia.
Clergy, intellectuals, and sort of middle-class peasants.
Yes. But there was a particular, I wonder if you could just tell us about, there was the timber situation, the timber industry, where, in fact, you know, there was an extraordinary amount of slave labour and whatever. And so Labour and people in the Labour Party here would not have known about that? Or they would and have said, OK, it's, you know?
Yeah. No, very definitely did. And in fact, this was the original story which got me on to what became the whole book, because I was writing a Gulag history. And then in the process, I was looking through some reports of what had been going on in Parliament, and I found questions about this. And it so shocked me, then I looked deeper into it. What happened was that as Stalin took power, he decided that the time had come really to break the power of the countryside. And so he ordered the deportation of between 1.5 million and 1.8 million peasants. The wealthier peasants, but nonetheless they were what we would probably consider to be smallholders, together with intellectuals, together with priests, and they were taken in cattle trucks to the far northwest of Russia and to Siberia to work in labour camps cutting timber for the Soviet export market. Absolutely terrible conditions. They would be taken from their homes at sometimes only a few hours' notice, inadequately clothed, sometimes from the south of Ukraine. This was before the Ukraine famine ever started, and then shipped in cattle trucks. Elderly, men, women, children. 20,000 children died in the first year alone, and within a few years, 250,000 of them were dead. But they were in these camps cutting timber, and the most important and largest market was Great Britain. We were importing at today's value £500 million worth of timber a year. And it didn't take long before the story got out. There were a few stowaways who managed to get out on the ships. If any prisoners were found on the ships that they'd been loading, they were shot and their bodies thrown over the side. The stories started to come back from seafarers who'd been there. And questions were raised in Parliament fairly quickly. And the government was confronted and tried to say, well, we don't have the evidence, we don't know what's going on, we can't find out, and until we do, this is all just rumour, and this is an attack on the Labour government. Ramsay MacDonald had become Prime Minister in 1929, so at that time we had a Labour government. Yeah. And every single attempt by the Conservatives to raise the matter was stopped in the Commons, the supposedly unrepresentative House of Lords, actually became the forum on which it was discussed, and the government was challenged much more. And there was this campaign then that the churches really got behind, and in fact were the instigators of, because at the same time there was a tremendous amount of repression of religious believers. You could just be someone who supplied candles to a church, and it would be sufficient for you to be arrested. And so we ended up with a day of prayer, which was the protest that the churches could organise at the time, which was joined in by over 1 million people around the world. But the government paid no attention to that, and what I have found fascinating and horrifying is, by digging into Foreign Office records and cabinet minutes, I've discovered they knew exactly what was going on. They actually stopped an inquiry into the matter and blocked it for fear that the truth would come out. The wording, which is in the book, and I can't quite remember, was the fear, I think, that they said that if we stop the trade, it might harm trade elsewhere. There might be other trade with the empire that would need to be stopped too. But in fact, their own civil servants had told them this was completely spurious reason and didn't exist. And so the whole matter progressed with these deliberate obstructions, with these testimonies coming in to the Foreign Office and being ignored or dismissed by Dalton, who was Foreign Secretary Henderson's junior minister. And eventually the Conservatives managed to get it to one debate in Parliament in March 1931. And it was the most sorry affair. I think it was one of the most shameful, as far as I can see, one of the most shameful events in British parliamentary history, though I'm sure there may be many, which ended up with a government minister speaking on behalf of the government. One of his colleagues had previously said that Russian prisons were more humane than British prisons.
Yes, I read that.
It ended up with one government minister saying that the Soviets, this is the deportation of 1.5 million people. This is the death of 250,000 people. This is something which had been defended in the socialist press, in the Manchester Guardian, in the New Statesman, by some of the leading left-wing journalists of the day. This government minister said the Soviets are conducting a very interesting economic experiment and deserve to be allowed to continue it without outside interference, and we will give them every support that we can.
It's interesting, as you say, journalists, New Statesman, Guardian, whatever, there were a lot of fellow travellers, weren't there? I mean, like famous people who are still celebrated now, George Bernard Shaw, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, these people who, were extraordinary apologists, weren't they, for, what was actually going on. Were they actually just, willfully blind, do you think, when they,
In the case of the Webbs, yes, willfully blind. They were at the end of their lives. The Sidney and Beatrice Webbs, founders of the LSE, founders of the New Statesman, now buried in Westminster Abbey, honoured early socialists. They were at the end of their life, and they became absolutely enraptured by the great experiment, as it was called. They wrote a book which is as thick as mine, and went all the way around the world. And part of it was actually written for them by the Russian embassy, who had sent, they'd submitted their notes to the ambassador, who was their friend, they believed. The ambassador had sent them back to the Russian Foreign Ministry, where the propaganda was written, sent back, and then the propaganda reappears in their book. They were that gullible. And you get these ridiculous things like, Sidney Webb said, as far as the execution rate in Russia is concerned, it's comparable with any civilized country. In fact, I've done the numbers, and they were killing 500 times more people than were dying in the West. You can't say the same thing about George Bernard Shaw, though, and you mentioned him.
Yes, well, because it seems to me he was particularly egregious in some things that he said, isn't that right?
Well, we think of Shaw as My Fair Lady and absolutely, and lovely grey beard, and he was a very charismatic speaker. He was the interwar Labour Party's most famous propagandist. He was, he was the David Beckham at David Beckham's height, but the David Beckham of the Labour Party. Shaw, I believe, was one of the most hideous characters. He twice called for the invention of poison gas to dispose of those who were no use to society, by which he included capitalists, something that the National Socialists, with a different doctrine, I wouldn't call them socialists, but something the National Socialists obviously obliged. At various times he commended the execution that was going on in Russia, saying that really the Soviet secret police were the only people in a thoroughly communist nation who could be trusted to discharge such a responsibility wisely.
This is extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. He talked about how it was necessary to weed the garden. Yeah. But he had been saying this for a very long time. He wrote in 1920 a lengthy explanation of what socialism should look like in this country, and it included labour camps where people would be consigned on pain of death if they were not to work for society. Yeah. But all these things were ignored, or they were discounted, and he died an honourable death, and I think he is buried too in Westminster Abbey.
I think so, Poets' Corner probably. You know,
probably.
With right up to the current day, we had obviously academics like Eric Hobsbawm, who quite famously said that actually right up to the very end, I mean this is interesting, before he died, that it was sort of worth the few million deaths. That's in effect what he was saying, for the greater plan, as it were. And it's extraordinary how somehow these people remain in situ, didn't they? They weren't sort of drummed out of academia. They weren't in any way persecuted.
Because the end goal of the utopia was considered to be so morally good, it was worth the cost. Yeah. And Hobsbawm's comments, whatever they were, are reasonably consistent. They're actually consistent, and again, if you look at Venezuela today, they are in part consistent with the way people are looking at. There is a cost. People used to talk about you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs.
I know, but I think that the riposte to that, was somebody, a wag once said, was, where is the omelette?
Yes, indeed. Where is the omelette?
Giles, thank you very, very much. I mean, we could actually talk about this for a lot longer.
Indeed, I have done over many hundreds of pages.
You have many hundreds of pages. It's Labour and the Gulag by Giles Udy. And it is a very, very sobering read, but an extremely important one. Giles, thank you very, very much for coming on.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time on So What You're Saying Is. And do remember, if you've enjoyed it, go to our other interviews and do subscribe as well, won't you? Thanks very much. Bye-bye.